Sorry, say that again.
I shall raise a number of questions, but I think it's better for all of us to benefit from your insights and views in a free-flowing manner. So let's not confine ourselves to the questions only. I would very much appreciate if you share your views with a particular focus on the region and the US-China competition and its implications. So feel free. I mean,
how long would you like me to speak for? Roughly.
I think it will last like maybe 1 hour, 15 minutes, 1 hour, 20 minutes, because we would not like to steal your time, your valuable time. I know you're an extremely busy person, so if you bear with us for like 1 hour and 20 minutes or so, we would very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is that agreeable to you?
Yes, but what I'm asking is, how long would you like any kind of opening remarks to be, roughly?
Maybe, I mean, including the questions, maybe 45 minutes or so. I think that would give us enough space to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar.
Sure.
I think that would be ideal.
Yeah, I'm flexible, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Now we are waiting for Professor Ongun. Let me try to reach her on the phone. Just 1 minute, please.
Sure.
Professor Ongun will be with us in a moment.
I'm sorry for the delay. Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Mahbubani, you all welcome, and dear participants. I would like to thank His Excellency Kishore Mahbubani for participating this wonderful event organized by Başkent University Strategic Research Center and Ankara Policy Center. I would also like to thank Ambassador, His Excellency Ambassador Fatih Ceylan, for giving us the opportunity to listen to you. Also, I would like to thank you all for participating in such an interesting and important webinar titled of Challenges in Asia Pacific and China-US Competition. It's a great honor for us to host such an important name here. Kishore Mahbubani is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. He was a prominent and distinguished Singaporean diplomat and well-known academician, for he had served in Cambodia, Malaysia, Washington, D.C. and New York, and also assumed the presidency of the UN Security Council for 1 year, and as a result of his exceptional performance as a diplomat, he was awarded the Public Administration Medal by the Singapore government in 1998. He was later appointed the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, being a professor in the practice of public policy from 2006-2019, as well as he was elected as an honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has honored distinguished thinkers, including several of America's founding fathers since 1780. He has published copious books, book reviews, and articles, as well as attended numerous interviews. Among the well-known books he authored are The Asian 21st Century, Has China Won, and Has the West Lost It? The Asia-Pacific region, which we will talk today, is of great importance in the world for several reasons. Economically, the region is home to some of the world's largest and fastest growing economies, including China, Japan, South Korea, and India. These countries are major trading partners for many countries around the world, and the region as a whole is responsible for a significant portion of global economic activity. Additionally, the region is a major center of manufacturing, trade, and investment, and it is home to many of the world's leading companies and financial institutions. Politically, the region is home to several major powers and is a key center of international relations. The region is home to the United Nations' largest number of member states, including China, India, and Japan. The region also holds multiple international organizations such as Asia, APEC, and the Pacific Island Forum. Militarily, the region is home to several major powers and is a key center of international security. The region has multiple ongoing territorial disputes, such as the South China Sea and the Korean Peninsula. The region also hosts multiple military alliances and presence of foreign military bases. Culturally, the Asia-Pacific region is diverse and rich in cultural heritage, and it's a major source of inspiration and cultural exchange. The region is home to a wide range of cultures and traditions, including ancient civilizations like China and Japan, and diverse cultures like those of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Furthermore, the region has a rich cultural heritage with a diverse population and a long history of civilization, making it an important source of inspiration and cultural exchange globally. Overall, the Asia-Pacific region is of great importance in the world for its economic, political, military, and cultural significance. It's a key center of global activity and a major player in shaping the future of the world. China, extremely significant country in the region, has grown to become one of the most powerful economies in the world. It is currently the second largest economy after the United States and is projected to become the largest in the near future. China's economic power is the result of combination of factors, including its largest population, rapidly growing middle class, export-oriented economy, infrastructure and technological investments, and its role in global trade and commerce. It has become a major player in the global economy and continues to shape the world's economic landscape. On the other hand, this rapid development of China in every sector, including military power, intimidated the United States and posed a potential threat on its established world order since 1945. The competition between the United States and China has been growing in recent years and encompasses a wide range of areas, including economic, political, military, and technological spheres. Since Kishore Mahbubani will explain this subject in detail, I would like to end my words here and leave the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Fatih Ceylan. The floor is yours.
Your mic isn't on.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Ongun. First and foremost, let me express my thanks to you for cooperating with Ankara Policy Center on a topic which is of extreme importance globally, Asia-Pacific region and the US-China competition with all their implications for everyone, including Turkey. And let me express my gratitude to Kishore Mahbubani for kindly accepting our invitation to participate in this webinar today on such a seminal topic. Let me add a few words to what Professor Ongun has already elaborated with regard to Kishore Mahbubani. He's I should like to stress that he's among top 50 thinkers all around the world, a very prominent author who has written, to the best of my knowledge, 8 books and published numerous articles on foreign and security policies on a global basis. So we have a very prominent intellectual with depth, stature, and caliber in our midst today, albeit virtually, but we are extremely happy to have you with us today. As I told you before the webinar, you have colleagues that you worked together in the past. Let me repeat them: Ambassador Ümit Pamir, Ambassador Taner Seven, and we have also our current Ambassador Burçin Gönenli participating from Singapore. Okay, let me immediately try to ask you a number of questions based on which you can share your views with our audience. And this is being recorded, by the way, and we will make it sure that we will disseminate it to the larger segments of our society here in Turkey, because the situational awareness on Asia-Pacific region is in dire need here. Many people are concentrating on what's going on in Ukraine with the war initiated by Russia, but the genuine challenges reside in the Asia-Pacific region, certainly with their global repercussions. So I think personally that tectonic shifts took place, particularly in the aftermath of the occupation and annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. And when we look at the strategies, national security and defense strategies of particularly 3 major powers, that's the US and China, and I'm a fan of reading such strategies. I know that you also elaborate such strategies in your books. I'm well aware of it. Now, we see concrete shifts towards a strategic competition, not immediately in the aftermath of 2014, but particularly if we take the year 2015, there you see different perceptions coming to the fore and shaping the politics of these 3 major powers, the United States, Russia, and China. So how would you describe the current global order becoming a scene for such strategic rivalry among these 3 powers? And what, in your opinion, are the implications of this rising power politics for the Indo-Pacific region with an eye on the priorities of Singapore there in the region. Could you please elaborate your views and share them with the audience? Thank you once again. One final announcement I have to make is that at the end of the webinar, we will certainly have a Q&A session, and we would expect our audience to have their questions posed through the chat, please. And I shall ask them on your behalf, with your permission, to Kishore Mahbubani. Thanks once again, and now we are all ears on your views. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank Professor Ongun for a very warm and generous words of welcome to me. I deeply appreciate them. And thank you very much, Ambassador Ceylan, for inviting me to join this very high-powered conversation with some of my old friends. I'm very happy to see them again over Zoom. And I'm, of course, very happy to join this discussion because we are actually living through one of the most interesting periods of human history. And certainly the world of geopolitics is coming back in a ferocious way, as also indicated by your question earlier. And the key thing for us to realize is that, and I would, by the way, put Russia in a slightly different category. I would say the two key powers here, the United States and China, their power is on a scale that has never before been seen in human history. So the contest between the United States and China is the largest geopolitical contest we have seen, because we've never had powers as powerful as the United States and China before. And Russia, to some extent, is a smaller actor in this game. And of course, Russia looms very large in Europe and should loom very large in Europe. And I would say, in some ways, I do say that the countries of the European Union have been geopolitically incompetent in managing Russia, because the test of geopolitical competence and incompetence is whether or not there are wars or no wars. And the fact that you have a major war going on today on the doorstep of Europe is a testimony to the incompetence of the European Unions. And by contrast, by the way, the place where there should have been the biggest war should have been East Asia, because East Asia is where the two biggest powers of the world collide today, United States and China. And amazingly, East Asia, despite all the tensions we have seen, has been more or less at peace for over 40 years now. Indeed, the last war that was fought in East Asia was the one, the Sino-Vietnamese War, when China punished Vietnam for its invasion of Cambodia in 1978. So that you can imagine how times have changed in this region. Now, the big question, therefore, is for the world is what is going to happen to the US-China relationship. And that's why actually I wrote my book, which I think both of you referred to, Professor Ongun and you, which the book I written called Has China Won? And we need to understand what is driving this US-China geopolitical contest. And what the most important thing to know about this US-China geopolitical contest is that it's driven by deep structural forces and is not due to personalities. I say this with some confidence because if you read my book, Has China Won? It was published in early 2020 when President Donald Trump was president of United States then. And in paragraph 1, I say that this geopolitical contest by the United States against China was launched by President Donald Trump, but it will outlast him. Even if he goes, he will continue. And sure enough, he lost the elections in November 2020, even though he refused to accept that he had lost. He lost the elections in November 2020. A new president came along, Joe Biden, and we all know that Joe Biden is a much nicer guy than Donald Trump, but it made no difference. The US-China geopolitical contest continued, and indeed, in some ways, the United States has become more aggressive under Joe Biden towards China than even Donald Trump was. So it's not driven by personalities. It's driven by deeper structural forces. And so what are these structural forces? In my book, Has China Won? I point out there are at least three structural forces. The first one, of course, is what I call an iron law of geopolitics that's been around for 2,000 years. And the iron law of geopolitics is that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States of America, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. No great power happily, voluntarily concedes its position as number one to the number two power. And the United States today believes that it has about 10 years to stop China from becoming number one. And because it feels there's this very narrow window of time, it is stepping up its actions against China. So the first set of actions that were taken to stop China was the trade war that President President Donald Trump launched against China in 2018, 2019. And that was the first wave of things to try and stop China. More recently, as you saw in 2022, President Joe Biden signed in the CHIPS Act. And the purpose of the CHIPS Act is to deny China access to the most advanced chips, deny China access technology that will create the chips, deny China access to machines that will create these chips. So it's a whole effort to say, hey, we will not let you, China, to overtake us. And so that is obviously the number one structural force. And this structural force, everyone speaks about, everyone knows about it. In fact, the Harvard professor Graham Allison, who actually endorsed my book Has China Won, has written a book called Destined for War, in which he says you get what he calls a Thucydides trap, that the number one power will always push down the number two power. But what's interesting is that while the first structural force is one that everyone speaks about, the second structural force is one that nobody speaks about. And the second structural force is what I call the fear of the yellow peril. I'm not sure how that translates into Turkish languages, but the fear of the yellow peril in the Western imagination has been there for 800 years or so, ever since the Mongols almost conquered Europe. And so there is a kind of emotional, visceral fear of the yellow man. And that emotional factor is a key factor in the US-China relationship, and that we should also try to understand. Because quite often what I see in the US-China relationship is not a rational reaction in many areas by the United States, but an emotional reaction by the United States. And that emotional reaction is driven by the fear of the yellow peril. And it's anyone who says, no, that's a figment of imagination. I want you all to know that in the United States Congress, almost 130 years ago, passed an act called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. I'll repeat the title again, Chinese Racial Exclusion Act, to keep out the Chinese people from coming to the United States. Why? Because of the fear of the yellow peril. So you can see, therefore, that this fear of the yellow peril is alive and well and very much part of the American imagination. and is also an emotional factor driving the US-China geopolitical contest. And the third structural force, of course, is the ideological dimension. Because what's interesting is that the United States today, as a country, is deeply divided politically, deeply divided. The Democrats and Republicans cannot agree on anything. But the only thing they can agree on is that it's time to stand up to China. And of course, they have to create an ideological justification for standing up to China. And the ideological justification is that, well, as President Joe Biden says, this is the contest between democracies and autocracies. That's the word he uses. And says, well, if China became democratic, then United States would have no problems with China. Of course, my two comments on this ideological justification is, number one, I believe that even if China became completely democratic tomorrow, United States will still try to stop the rise of China, because it doesn't matter whether China is democratic or autocratic. They just want China to be number 2 and not number 1. So the democracy is basically an excuse that is used to justify the American campaign against China. And the second thing is, of course, the United States is by and large a pragmatic country, and is actually in practice willing to cooperate with lots of autocratic countries, even though it says it's against autocracies. So ironically, when the United States first engaged China, I think 52 years ago, when Henry Kissinger went to China in his famous, I think July 1971 secret visit to China, when he went there, China was far more autocratic under Mao Zedong. It's far less autocratic under Xi Jinping today. And despite that fact, the United States embraced China. And as you all know, that was because of the Cold War, and the United States was looking for an ally against the Soviet Union, and so it embraced the autocratic China against the then Soviet Union. And of course, today, United States has got other autocratic allies that it embraces to try and counterbalance China, including, by the way, a country called Vietnam in Southeast Asia, which is also run by the Communist Party. So therefore, this ideological justification is one that is very difficult to frankly justify and use as a pillar for explaining what the actions that are being taken by United States against China. So just to conclude this opening part, I'm happy to respond now to your second or third question, is that clearly this US-China contest is driven by deep structural forces, and I have absolutely no doubt that it will gain momentum over the next 10 to 20 years, and we should all get ready for a rough ride as a result of this geopolitical contest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your comments and views that expanded our horizon with regard to what's going on both in the Asia-Pacific region, or what the United States authorities would like to call Indo-Pacific, and the ever-increasing competition between the United States and China. I think I should open a little parenthesis here, because when I read the strategies of both the United States and China, what I had noticed is that, for instance, under the Trump administration, the national security strategy of the United States, China is mentioned under the banner of Indo-Pacific. Whereas when I went through the strategy promulgated by the US Biden administration in October 2022, there is a separate chapter on China consisting of 10 paragraphs in sharp contrast to the Trump administration's strategy, and in stronger words, by the way. So that's where we are. Of course, China also responded to it in 2019, particularly in 2019, by issuing a national defense strategy paper for a new era. And when you compare these two strategies, which are also reflected in their sub-strategies on different issues, then the tone in the Chinese strategy is, I would say, softer in comparative terms with that of the United States strategy. You have touched upon on a very crucial topic, dear Kishore, while elaborating your multi-layered frame of structural forces. And that is the paradox faced by the West, and maybe also by China, I don't know. I think you have a better sense of it, on that two important variables. That is, we have opportunities on the one side, which are not denied by either party, and challenges. And to put it in other words, you have interests on one side, and you have values on the other side. But whenever interests are involved, of course, values are more than often put in the back burner while pursuing foreign and security policies. That is unfortunate because these are lofty, ideals, shared values like pluralistic democracy, civil liberties and rule of law. But when it comes to national interests, I think we see major powers shaping the world events try to kind of put them at the back burner or circumvent such cardinal values, actually. So how do you see that? I mean, opportunities versus challenges, because without the cooperation of China, for instance, we simply cannot fight climate crisis. And also in terms of pandemics, we all of us need the cooperation of China, not only Turkey, but the United States and the rest of the world. Also on counterterrorism activities or man-made or natural-made disasters, floods, wildfires, and what have you. So how do you see the balance between, or is there a balance between opportunities and challenges? On the opportunities part, for instance, when you look at the Western strategies, not only the United States, there seems to be a difference. The European countries in NATO and also in the EU see China from a different perspective and try to focus on the opportunities as well. In contrast, the United States seems to put more premium on the challenges part. So there's a kind of balance stricken between the United States and Europe in terms of China policies. That is my observation. So how do you see this evolving? I mean, this paradox between opportunities, challenges, and interests and values evolve in the future, particularly as it impacts on the US-China relationship. Thank you.
Well, I must say you framed the question very well, Ambassador Ceylan. You talk in terms of opportunities, challenges, interests, and values. But I think all these four factors are at play in the US-China relationship, and also in terms of the relationship within US and China and the rest of the world too. Now, as I answer your question, I want to emphasize that hopefully a key point to my friends in Turkey, that you'll find that I'm quite critical of what the United States is doing. But the reason I'm critical is that I believe that, you know, people and countries suffer if they only have unloving critics or uncritical lovers. I'm a loving critic of the United States of America. I'm trying to advise the United States to pursue a better course of action for the United States and for the American people, because I actually believe that current American policies will not be good for the American people in the long run. So I'm not trying to destroy the United States. I'm trying to help the United States pursue a better course of action, certainly a better course of action in terms of managing the rise of China. And so I'll make 2 or 3 points. The first point I'll make, you began by referring to the national strategy documents. Now, you see, just because you produce a strategy document doesn't mean you have a strategy. Indeed, in my book, As China Won, I say very upfront that the problem that the United States has in dealing with China is that it has launched a major geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And I say that insight is not mine. That insight was given to me by, of course, America's greatest living strategic thinker today, Henry Kissinger. I had a one-on-one lunch with him in 2018, and that's what he said to me. And tragically, even till today, the United States doesn't have a strategy. And just to illustrate one simple point, you know, you referred to the concept of Indo-Pacific, right? And of course, the Americans were saying, we want to strengthen the Indo-Pacific region and so on and so forth. But all their definitions of Indo-Pacific do not include China. And whereas by contrast, the countries in this region, certainly, like you take, for example, the ASEAN countries, and I must emphasize to everyone listening today that I hope you will pay a lot of attention to what the ASEAN countries are doing or saying, because they make up almost 700 million people. And by 2030, ASEAN will be the 4th largest economy in the world. ASEAN is growing very, very rapidly. And ASEAN's role is very, very critical in terms of managing the US-China relationship too. And the ASEAN countries believe that it is foolish to try and exclude China from this, from any kind of Indo-Pacific cooperation arrangements. So the first point is that the United States doesn't have a strategy. The second point is that China has a strategy. And that's very important to understand, because, you know, as you know, the Chinese anticipated an American containment strategy against China maybe 20 years ago, way back. They knew it was coming. They knew as they got more powerful, United States would take actions against China, and they were right. United States has taken actions against China. So they launched a preemptive strike against an American containment policy. And the way they did that is by enhancing their trade and investment links with the whole world, right? And I can tell you, for example, if you take ASEAN again, 20 years ago in the year 2000, United States trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, 135. But China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion. So US trade was more than 3 times ASEAN's trade, right? 135 versus 40. But by 2020, 20 years later, even though US trade had grown 2.5 times from 135 billion to about $300 billion or so, China's trade with ASEAN had gone from 40 billion to 800 billion, 20 times. And so ASEAN became the largest trading partner of China. I mean, that's amazing, right? In 20 years, from $40 billion to $800 billion. But this trade is not just driven by economic considerations. This trade is also driven by geopolitical considerations, because this ensures that the ASEAN countries will not join a containment policy against China. In fact, all the ASEAN countries have said clearly, strongly, that they will not take sides in the US-China contest. They want to be friends with United States, and they want to be friends with China. And that shows that the Chinese have a strategy. And by the way, this strategy of engaging the rest of the world by China is not just confined to Southeast Asia, which is a neighbor of China. If you take a country like Brazil, Brazil is far, far away from China. In fact, Brazil is much closer to the United States than it is to China. But today, Brazil's trade with China is 3 times Brazil's trade with the United States. Again, so why would Brazil, the largest country in Latin America, want to join a containment policy against China? Because they will lose a lot. So you can see, therefore, the Chinese have carried out a consistent long-term policy. And here, in terms of interests and values, it's a very interesting point you made, Ambassador Ceylan. If you look at the interests of the American people, the interests of the American people will be better served if in addition to competition, they also cooperate with China on areas of common interest. And you were absolutely right to refer to climate change, to pandemics, to terrorism. Yes, that's exactly why they need to cooperate with each other. And today, frankly, at a time when the average income of the bottom 50% of China's population hasn't gone up in over 30 years, there's clearly the priority of the United States should be to focus on improving the standard of living of its people. And here I can say this, since you mentioned paradoxes here, one of the paradoxical results of the trade war is that it has actually made life worse for the people in the bottom 50% of America's population, because China was helping them to cope with their lack of increase of incomes by providing them with cheap products. But now when the United States imposes tariffs on the Chinese products, the Chinese people are not suffering. The American people are suffering the consequences of these tariffs imposed on Chinese products. Therefore, it would be wiser for the United States to stop its trade war, because it will be in the interest of the American people to stop this trade war and find ways and means of cooperating with China in these areas. So I hope I've addressed your question on challenges and opportunities and interests and values.
Thank you. I think we can now turn to questions and answers period. I have to assure the audience that I'm following the chat room. There's no doubt about it. There's already one question by Ambassador Halit Çevik. I shall come back to it. But I believe that our keynote speaker today, Professor Ongun, has a question, and it's her privilege to raise her question directly. And in the meantime, I'll be following the chat, trying to note down the questions raised, and I shall come back to them. Professor Ongun, I believe you have a question for Kishore Mahbubani. Could you please ask a question? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Mahbubani, considering the recent developments, like the global ramifications of Ukraine war, which has amplified the global competition between US and China, North Korea breaking a record for missile launches in 2022, China's proactive and assertive security policy in South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, and Japan unveiling record defense budget, as well as AUKUS, military alliance between the US, Australia, and UK. What do you think would likely be the long-term implications of such a growingly security-oriented regional tendency in Asia?
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I hope that my answer doesn't surprise you. You know, if you live in Asia, you tend to be very optimistic about the future, especially in East Asia. But if you talk to Europeans or to some extent the Americans, you feel very pessimistic about the future. And it may be a classic case of one side seeing the glass half empty and the other side seeing the glass half full. So we Asians see the glass half full because the last 30 years of socioeconomic development in Asia have been the best 30 years in 3,000 years of our history. So we are very happy in East Asia. And the next 30 years, I'll give you some data, will also be better for us. Now, or each of the issues you mentioned, number one, Ukraine. The Ukraine war is completely irrelevant to East Asia. Okay, it may affect to some extent US-China relations, but China, if you notice, has been very restrained in its support of Russia. Indeed, the real secret of the China-Russia relationship is that there is a lot of suspicion between China and Russia. In theory, they are allies. In practice, they're very suspicious of each other. And that's why you notice China hasn't helped Russia in any significant way on the Ukraine war. In fact, China was very upset with Russia for launching the Ukraine war because in the year 2022, when President Xi Jinping was working towards his third term in office, he wanted calm and stability. Instead, he got a very painful war in Europe. So the Ukraine war, China was not happy about it, number one. And then when you mention North Korea missile tests, the North Koreans have been doing tests for 30 years, 40 years, but there's no war. Mm-hmm. And I predict there'll be no war in the Korean Peninsula. So don't worry. The only reason why the North Koreans fire tests is to get attention. And I think and I always say that, frankly, the best thing the United States could do is to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea, because diplomacy was invented to talk to enemies. And once the United States established diplomatic relations with North Korea, the North Koreans don't feel that they have to carry out tests, to get attention. Now, there will be no war also on the South China Sea. There are differences between the 4 ASEAN states, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and China, over issues in the South China Sea. But there'll be lots of private negotiations, private consultations between the two sides. So I'm not pessimistic there'll be any kind of war. And certainly at this stage, since China needs the ASEAN countries, I think China will be very careful and restrained on the South China Sea. Now, the most explosive issue is the one you mentioned is, of course, of the ones you mentioned is Taiwan. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that if Taiwan declares independence, China will declare war on Taiwan. That's very, very clear. And this is the result of the century of humiliation that China suffered, from 1842 to 1949. And, by the way, just for your listeners here, I produced a free EDX course on China's century of humiliation. I recommend it to you because to understand why China behaves the way it does, it's important to understand that part of China's history, the century of humiliation, because Taiwan was first separated from China. Taiwan used to be part of China. It was separated from China after China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. That was part of the century of humiliation. So for China, getting Taiwan back eventually is something that is non-negotiable. But at the same time, China is not in any hurry. And so if you leave the status quo alone, don't change anything. And you know, if Taiwan continues to maintain that it is still representing all of China, which is what it claims, because it says it's the Republic of China, and the People's Republic of China claims it represents all of China, then both agree that there's one China. So if the United States doesn't change its one China policy, then there'll be no war across the Taiwan Strait. And here I must say, by the way, that one of the positive developments of recent times was that President Joe Biden had a very good meeting with President Xi Jinping in November during the G20 meeting in Bali. And I think after that meeting, the temperature in the Taiwan Straits went down. And I can tell you, I happened to meet the President of Indonesia, President Jokowi. I had breakfast with him in Bali at the G20 meeting site 2-3 days before the G20 meeting. And I told President Jokowi, I said, if you can arrange a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, the world will thank you for it. And he said, don't worry, I'll give them the nicest room in Bali for the meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping. And I think he did, because as you saw, they had a successful meeting, and the relations between US and China to some extent has stabilized since that meeting. And I hope that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken will go to Beijing. I hope that the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will go to Beijing, and this will help to stabilize the relationship a bit. So overall, I'm not pessimistic on the issues that you raised.
Mr. Mahbubani, nice to hear from you. We can be hopeful for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again. Questions are coming in. I think in a visible manner. So let me try to consolidate them to the best of my ability. One of the questions is, of course, the intra-Asian relations. You have mentioned about the ASEAN, the importance of ASEAN and the criticality of policies pursued by ASEAN members vis-a-vis China, which is very important. But when we look at the picture with regard to ASEAN, we also see that ASEAN members are eerie about the Chinese unilateral initiatives, for instance, in South China Sea or East China Sea, for that matter, like the construction of artificial islands and the deployment of military personnel over there, together with some assets, and also increasing Chinese presence in the reefs in the region. Now, on the one side, we have this nervousness, growing nervousness on the part of ASEAN members, particularly in the domain of security and the ambiguity of Chinese intentions or ambitions. On the other hand, one cannot deny the fact that, as you have underlined, there has been a highly, growing ties in economy, commerce, and investment, and what have you. So it's a kind of mixed perception on the part of the ASEAN members. So how do you see the future of, South China Sea? You mentioned about the Taiwan, of course, which is important. East China Sea, the dispute between China and Japan, on what Japanese call Senkaku Islands, what Chinese call Diarunu. I cannot pronounce it anyway. But how do you see the development of this for the future? And the other issues, of course, about the Central Asia, towards which Turkey also has, important ties. So how would this impact the relationship between ASEAN members and China? also with an eye on the Taiwan issue, because the Taiwanese issue is also a kind of a thorn in the region, not only for the United States, but for the rest of the countries. And the other question, of course, is that you have mentioned this issue en passant, very briefly, India. What could India do in the region, and what kind of role India could play in the region? Now we see, for instance, like skirmishes taking place at the line of actual control between India and China, starting from the 60s, coming up until December 2022, this clash between the troops over there. India becoming more kind of discernible in the framework of Quad, quadrilateral security dialogue, increasing its ties with everyone, like the United States, Russia, and China. So India is a critical player over there. There's no doubt about it. So how do you see like the ties developing between ASEAN members and China, and also the role of India in the Asia-Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you raised some very, very good questions. Thank you very much for them. One about ASEAN-China relationship, two about Central Asia, and three about India. And by the way, I must tell you all that when you live next door to a big country, it's very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So it's like sleeping next to an elephant. So even if the elephant is very peaceful, if the elephant rolls over, the elephant can crush you. So it is uncomfortable. And certainly China is the world's fastest growing elephant, which is why I emphasize that the ASEAN countries want to have good relations with China, and they want to have good relations with the United States. They would like to have two elephants rather than one elephant, so that the two elephants balance each other out in our region. That's why ASEAN is also strengthening its relations with the United States too. And on Central Asia, I won't say too much because I don't follow Central Asia very closely, but there's no doubt that as a result of the Ukraine war, Russia has been weakened. With Russia weakening, Russian influence in Central Asia has gone down. And this has, of course, created opportunities for Turkey and China to expand their influence in Central Asia. And I predict that that will also carry on. But India, of course, is frankly the next big actor on the world stage. And I actually have an article that was published in an Indian journal called India Today. It just came out last week, saying that India can emerge as the third independent pole in a multipolar world. India will become the third most important power in the world. And it's important to emphasize one, since I want to emphasize the positive dimension all the time, I want to emphasize that the future growth in the world's economy is going to come from the new CIA. CIA doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, and ASEAN. And I want to emphasize that the growth in the next 10, 20 years is going to come from CIA. And just to support my point, if you add up the total population of CIA, it comes to about 3.4 billion people, 1.4 in China, 1 billion in China, 1.3 billion in India, 700 million in ASEAN. Out of these 3.4 billion people, that's almost half the world's population, 40% of the world's population. Out of these 3.4 billion people, in the year 2000, there were only 150 million enjoying middle-class living standards, only 150 million. But by 2020, the number had grown 10 times, from 150 million to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, the number will become close to 3 billion people in the middle class. So you can see, therefore, There will be massive, this will all become rapidly growing economies. And India, I predict, will become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And India already, as you know, today, if you look at the top 5 economies in the world in nominal market terms, number one is United States, number 2 is China, number 3 is Japan, number 4 is Germany, number 5 is India. So you can see out of the top 5, 3 are Asian already, right? China, Japan, and India. And you know, ASEAN also is growing very fast. Again, let me give you one more statistic. In the year 2000, which is not that far away, Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN's economy, 8 times bigger. Today, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN's economy will become bigger than Japan's. Now, these are phenomenal economic changes that are taking place in this region. And I hope you understand why we feel so optimistic for the future, because we anticipate that our regions is going to grow significantly over the next 10 to 20 years. And therefore, that's what's going to manage the differences. So when you talk about the differences about the rocks and the reefs and the building of military installations in South China Sea, that is very much a sideshow. The Anglo-Saxon media, which doesn't like the rise of China, provides a very distorted view of what's happening in China and a very distorted view of what's happening in the relations between China and its neighbors. So my one suggestion to you is, if you want to read and understand about China, don't read the Anglo-Saxon media. The Anglo-Saxon media will only give you negative press coverage of China and will not give you any kind of... so if the Anglo-Saxon media have been right over the last 20 years, they've been predicting the collapse of China every few years. After the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, they predicted the collapse of China, and guess what? China grew even faster after the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So you're absolutely right. There are big differences between China and India, some differences between China and ASEAN. And certainly the border issue, as you said, has to be managed between China and India. But I think at the end of the day, if China and India realize that the next 10 years of economic growth can be the best years of economic growth, they'll find ways and means of containing their differences while focusing on their economic development. So the key thing to watch is that in East Asia and South Asia, there's a culture of pragmatism. And that culture of pragmatism will enable them to carry on growing despite the differences, which are real and which have to be managed.
Well, thank you very much indeed. But I believe that I think we should not do disservice to the Western community of nations outside the Anglo-Saxon community. There are some differences, of course. When you look at the UK integrated strategy document and the rest of continental European countries. Despite, for instance, I do remember that before coming to the 2021 NATO summit, Boris Johnson said, we do not sustain the intention of waging a Cold War with China. He said it in very explicit terms, which was later reinforced by some remarks also made by Biden. For instance, in Bali, after his meeting with Xi Jinping, he said that we do not have the intention of initiating a Cold War between the United States and China. Of course, these are words, but in practice, we may see a different picture evolving. When we look at the Chinese side, of course, there have been a series of very ambitious projects which would create grounds for some suspicions. Like, for instance, Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of the biggest projects of this century, I have to say, which Xi Jinping announced in 2013, which was followed by Made in China 2025. And then the program of being #1 in artificial intelligence by 2030, and the foundation of the People's Republic of China, 2049, global China. A big vision. I mean, when you read it, it's incredible. So at the same time, we have the Chinese ambitions. I totally agree with you that we should not rely solely on the thinking that is prevalent nowadays in the Anglo-Saxon world. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, I think we have to counterbalance that with the projects and intentions and ambitions being elaborated by China, albeit in a different framework. But that's where we are. And when you look at their, for instance, modernization efforts of military and defense structures, there has been a visible increase in their capabilities. There's no doubt about it. And they don't hide it, by the way. I mean, when I read the Western analysis, they say it's opaque. It's not opaque. It's open, out in the public. They write it, they announce it, they explain it. So there is this kind of bifurcation on the perceptions with regard to China. This type of competing aspirations, okay, and the urge by the United States to kind of contain China in Asia Pacific, and the revisionist Russia making itself fully visible in a global framework. How do you see the security picture, evolving that would kind of adapt and transcend the existing global architecture? And also, again, if you can articulate a little bit your views on a different governance in China. China says it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's how they describe it. And would that be sustainable? I mean, can China sustain and realize all these ambitious targets that it announced in the future, like 2025, 2030, 2049, and on and on? So can you please elaborate whether you see China with a certainly different body politic and culture going on in this kind of competition? One final remark is that it will certainly be a kind of dual track approach, both for China and also for the West. By dual track, I mean we will see these confrontations rising from time to time, creating tensions and what have you. But on the other hand, we need this dialogue and engagement, which was also demonstrated by China, by the way. For instance, when there was this rising tension between the United States and China on the Taiwan issue, we have seen the Chinese ambassador in Brussels having contact with NATO, for instance. Now NATO Ceylan is going to Japan and South Korea very soon. And there had been some context in the past between NATO, for instance, and China, like Shangri-La dialogue, okay? So how do you see this rather complex picture evolving, whereas we have on one track the confrontational aspect, on the other track this cooperative, drive towards dialogue and engagement, and how that would impact the global architecture, both in terms of politics, economics, and also security-wise? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I must say, you raised again very, very good questions. You touched upon the BRI in your opening remarks about how countries are getting involved in it. You discussed global security architecture and also China's governance too. I think these are the three areas I'll try to cover if I can. On the BRI, by the way, I understand, by the way, I heard it on BBC very briefly, that you now have a new train linking Istanbul to your airport. And that I believe the train was built by China. And that 800,000 passengers, I think, will be taking advantage of that train. So I presume that the people who take that train, which is going to go at about 120 kilometers an hour, will get a first-hand sense of what China can do in infrastructure. And I can tell you that around the world, many countries want to do what Turkey has done, to work with China to build fast trains. So Laos has built a fast train, and in Indonesia, the fast train between its capital, Jakarta, and its second city, Bandung, is also being built by China. So the Belt and Road Initiative, even though the United States and the Anglo-Saxon media have campaigned against the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, 140 countries have 140 out of 193 countries have signed agreements with China to join the BRI. So the Anglo-Saxon media therefore gets the BRI again all wrong. Now on China's internal governance structure, I think basically the leaders of China know that at the end of the day, they have to deliver better living standards to their population. And as long as they can deliver better living standards to their population, I think they can stay in office. And if you look at my book, Has China Won? I cite a study done by Harvard Kennedy School. Now, Harvard Kennedy School is an independent institution. It is not controlled by the Chinese government. So the Harvard Kennedy School has come out with a study showing that support for the Chinese Communist Party has gone up from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016. And that's amazing, okay? Very few countries enjoy that level of support from their population. And that's not because they love the Communist Party. It is that the Communist Party has delivered significant improvements to their standard of living. So whenever you read the Anglo-Saxon media that says the Chinese Communist Party is about to collapse, I say don't, it's not going to happen soon. So the Chinese internal governance, but I must acknowledge though, that this year, China has not handled well its exit from zero COVID. That's been done very chaotically. And that I think has affected the standing, the image of the Chinese government inside China and globally too. So that the Chinese leaders are humans, they also make mistakes from time to time. They're not perfect. So we cannot think that they're gods and they get everything right. They don't. They make mistakes also. But the last and most important point is about the global security architecture. And here I must say that overall in Asia, very few countries are eager to join NATO. I know in Europe, there's many countries want to join NATO, but in Asia, I think the feeling is that it's better to have inclusive architectures rather than exclusive architectures. You know, as you know, there's a big debate about what started this war in Ukraine. Big debate that is still going on. But you have all, I'm sure, seen the writings and heard the lectures of Professor John Mearsheimer from Chicago. If you haven't had him on your program, I encourage you to have him on your program. He's not very popular now, but I think he puts across a point of view which would have been supported by other leaders like George Kennan, Owen Harris in the United States, which said that the constant expansion of NATO to the border of Russia was not wise, because while you were threatening Russia, you were not giving Russia a door to join you also. And even though Gorbachev called for a common house of Europe when he was in office, that offer was rejected. Now, by contrast, there is a common house for Asia that is being developed, which is secret, which you cannot see. And that secret is all based on the regular ASEAN meetings. Now, I can assure you every year when the ASEAN countries meet, both in their ministerial level and at the leaders level at the East Asian Summit, everybody comes. So we invite the United States, we invite China. We invite Japan, we invite South Korea. We invite India, we invite Pakistan. And so we invite the European Union, we invite Russia. You see, it doesn't matter to us if you're enemies. That's irrelevant. You may be enemies, but as far as we are concerned, you are a key player, you must come and join the ASEAN meetings. And therefore, we in ASEAN have created the most inclusive architecture in the whole world. And that's what is keeping our region stable. And we have also last year, January 2022, launched the world's largest free trade agreement. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes the 10 ASEAN countries, which includes China, Japan, South Korea. I think you know that China and Japan are rivals. Japan and South Korea are rivals. And we also include Australia and New Zealand. So we have created in East Asia, through ASEAN, a very inclusive architecture. And the lesson that I think the Europeans should learn from Asia, because, you know, I want to make a very harsh point about the Europeans. You know, the Europeans used to run the world in the 18 and 19 and first half of the 20th century. They conquered the world. They colonized all corners of the world. And therefore, they believe that they are inherently superior. And because they believe they're inherently superior, they do not know how to learn lessons from the rest of the world. So I can tell you, when I came out with my book, The Asian 21st Century, it's a free book. It's an open access book. You can download it for free. That is published by a German publisher. The CEO of Springer Nature, Mr. Stefan von Holzbring, told me that if you get 20,000 downloads of a book called The Asian 21st Century, it'll be very good. I can tell you that instead of 20,000 downloads, that book has been downloaded 2.59 million times in 160 countries. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because the whole world is getting ready for the Asian century, while the Europeans are still stuck in the 19th and 20th century, and the Europeans still think that they can run the world in the way that they used to. So the leading European minds are out of touch with the real world. And I say this very sadly as a friend of Europe. So and I hope that Turkey can play an important role of acting as a bridge between Asia and Europe, because your main job is to educate the Europeans and teach them that their capacity to dominate the world in the way they used to is over. And NATO is not the answer for creating a new global security architecture. Europe is going to learn a new way of working with Asia. And in the best way to do that is to engage ASEAN.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also follow ASEAN Plus Defense Ministers meeting, of course. I mean, when we talk about ASEAN, it's mainly focused on economic, commercial, and investment aspects of cooperation. Do you believe that there could be a nucleus of security and defense, a more expanded version of ASEAN Plus Defense Ministers to maintain a security pillar within ASEAN for the future, of course, not immediately, because of the conflicting views and positions taken by ASEAN members themselves in their relations with China. Do you, for instance, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is that a panacea for security of Asia Pacific. So it has to be reinforced by a different grouping, an enlarged grouping, as you said, an inclusive structure, whereby all interests will be accommodated to the extent possible. So do you think that ASEAN could play a role in the future in terms of security and defense? Thank you.
I think ASEAN is already playing a role in terms of security and defense. The thing about ASEAN is that ASEAN creates a lot of different organizations. You mentioned the ASEAN plus defense ministers meetings, which are useful. But ASEAN has also created something called the ASEAN Regional Forum, which brings in all the competing parties. So we have North Korea and South Korea in the same room, right? I mean, that's what ASEAN Regional Forum does. It puts Russia and United States in the same room, right? And so it includes India and Pakistan in the same room. So, the ASEAN Regional Forum is just one of the things that ASEAN does. And the sad part about ASEAN, I wrote a book, I co-authored a book called The ASEAN Miracle that was published in 2017 on the 50th anniversary of ASEAN. And I said ASEAN deserves a Nobel Peace Prize because ASEAN has delivered more peace than any other organization has, And I can tell you that if you look at Southeast Asia, when the Cold War ended in 1990, everybody said that the big wars will be fought in Southeast Asia, East Asia, because that's the Balkans of Asia. But instead, after the Cold War ended, there have been no wars in Southeast Asia and wars in the Balkans of Europe. Look at Yugoslavia, look at the war between Russia and Georgia, look at the war between Russia and Ukraine. It tells you something. You see, when you have wars, it reflects geopolitical incompetence. You don't understand that the world has changed and you're not adjusting and adapting. ASEAN is different. ASEAN is geopolitically competent. ASEAN has kept the peace in this region. Not just kept the peace, it has delivered tremendous prosperity to this region. So ASEAN is a secret actor in East Asia that no one is aware of. And it has done amazing things. And I can tell you, I started attending ASEAN meetings in 1971. That was 52 years ago. And when I went to ASEAN meetings in 1971, there was major suspicion of each other. And Indonesia and Malaysia just had a confrontasi. Relations between Indonesia and Malaysia were as bad as those between Greece and Turkey, right? They had just had a confrontation, right? And then Philippines was claiming Malaysia. Singapore and Malaysia had just separated. We all had difficulties 52 years ago. Today, you go to the same meetings, the distrust has evaporated. So ASEAN has done something quite remarkable. And frankly, ASEAN is also secretly guiding and advising other countries how to get along in this neighborhood. So that's why, and I would say, watch the next 10 years. If in the next 10 years, the ASEAN countries continues to grow, and if China continues to grow, and if India continues to grow, then you know that this region is getting things right and Europe is getting things wrong. Economic growth is the ultimate judge as to who's doing it right.
Well, thank you very much. And then we're fast approaching the end of our webinar. But I think we would be remiss if we were not to raise a question on Turkey-Singapore ties, how that can be developed against the backdrop of this ongoing competition, whether we like it or not. I talk about the strategic rivalry taking place. And what would your recommendations be to improve those bilateral ties? Also with an eye to the priorities of Singaporean foreign policy. So we will close the session with your remarks on that particular issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you very much for inviting me to this very high-powered panel discussion with such eminent personalities in Turkey. I do want to say that Singapore admires Turkey as a country. I mean, you have a much older and grander history. You've been an empire. Singapore has never been an empire, will never become an empire. We are very bullish for the prospects of Turkey because I think in many, many ways, Turkey, through its integration in Central Asia and through its growing ties with Southeast Asia, will also, I think, join the Asian growth story in many ways. And I know that when I speak to my former colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're very eager to step up their links with Turkey and do more things together. So I'm optimistic that over the next 10, 20 years, relations between Turkey and Singapore will improve in the years to come.
Thank you. Today, we are graced by the presence of Kishore Mahbubani, who's a great thinker, a prominent scholar, and a diplomat, of course. To the best of my knowledge, you spent 33 years in diplomacy and 18 years now in academia with a very well-known reputation. So we are really grateful for your participation today. We hope we can also meet in person whenever you come to visit Turkey, either in Istanbul or in Ankara. We would be more than pleased to host you again. So with these concluding remarks, I should like to request Professor Ongun to close the session. Please, Professor Ongun. Thanks once again to you, Kishore, and all the participants today. Be assured that we will certainly spread this webinar session to larger segments of Turkish society. And thank you once again.
Mr. Mahbubani, I'm grateful to you for your participation and sharing your valuable ideas and time with us. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Fatih Ceylan for making this organization possible. I also thank very much to all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.